Said at the end about this in characterizing this?
Well, I think that the judge recognizes that it's a tough day for anybody that enters a plea, and he recognizes that Alyssa's been cooperative in this investigation, and that's important. Both the prosecutor and the ethics commissioner are happy that, or are satisfied that we have a guilty plea and an admission of misconduct. As you know, this is a plea bargain. Once you read the investigative report, you'll see that there were over 40 emails back and forth between Alyssa and the Attorney General's office involving trying to get grant funds. Originally, it looks like federal funds through what was left over from the prior administration within 4 months after the Attorney General became the Attorney General. And that was later terminated because of what I think Mr. Simpson described as the arcane restrictions of federal grant monies, and it turned into the state grant. You'll see that as the process went forward that there are representations from Simpson that this was a done deal, that the grant had been approved prior to the committee review. And in fact, there's an email from Alyssa in October of '07 that the grant was approved, which was a month before the grant review committee internally in the Attorney General's office had heard about the grant. You'll see that there are concerns internally by attorneys from the Attorney General's office about a conflict of interest with respect to the grant. And in fact, a senior attorney, as a deputy solicitor, upon hearing of those concerns from one of the members of the committee, marched into Marc Dann's office and advised him that he had a direct problem because his spouse had a direct interest in the grant before the Attorney General's office. Who was the deputy solicitor here? Chris Geithner. Okay. It's in the report. Marc Dann then called in Simpson and told Simpson that he was upset about the grant being authorized, and thereafter directed others within the office to terminate the actual payment a month after the grant was authorized. So once you go through the report, I think you'll see that there was not an insubstantial amount of contact and involvement by Ms. Lenhoff in trying to secure the grant. The question of merit, there's no question about the underlying merit of the argument about cold cases, but definitely her relationship with her spouse, and that relationship created access to the former chief of staff and was the whole rationale for underpinning the grant to the university overall.
So do you believe that Marc was not involved in the grant approval?
I think you'll read the report, and the question of whether the Attorney General is involved in the grant is a question that's live in the report. But Simpson himself claims credit for trying to secure the approval of the grant through the committee that ultimately signed off reluctantly for the grant overall. Now, the Attorney General did sign a letter on January 28th. The former Attorney General did sign a letter on January 28th that was sent to Youngstown State University that advised Youngstown State University that they had been awarded the grant. That letter was received from an interview with the president and leadership at Youngstown State University, and then it was a month later, less than a month later, that in the payments of the checks that a staff member was called in and told to terminate the payment of the check.
By whom?
By the Attorney General.
So the deal is that Dan may or may not have tried to facilitate this grant and then pulled the plug once it was protested by Geithner?
I think what you'll see in the report are questions about why Simpson described the grant as a done deal before the committee, that was the review committee, was involved in reviewing the grant. You're going to see in the report that several members of the committee questioned whether or not there was not an active conflict of interest. And based upon that questions, the Deputy Solicitor General, Kurt Geithner, went directly to the Attorney General and advised him there was a direct conflict of interest, at which time the Attorney General called in Mr. Simpson and told him to terminate the grant. So that from the investigative report and the people that were interviewed, it's clear that the termination of the grant emanated or came from internally from senior staff within the Attorney General's office to the Attorney General.
If prior to pulling the plug, Dan did help facilitate this, is there culpability there potentially?
Well, under Ohio law, where a public official authorizes a grant in which their family member has an interest, that potentially has criminal sanctions or ramifications. Whether the Attorney General did so or not is part of the ongoing investigation.
So Marc Dann could face charges along with his wife in
Well,
this case?
this investigation continues, as I think you all know, with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office and with the Ethics Commission. And the results of that investigation will determine whether or not Mr. Dann does face charges.
Could Edgar Simpson have been charged in connection with this as well for his role?
Edgar Simpson could have been charged, and as you remember, that was a plea bargain. Mr. Simpson was cooperative, as well as has been Mr. Gutierrez and Mr. Jennings.
Who will she be testifying against in future weeks, as was mentioned in the courtroom?
I have no idea who she will be testifying against. I think what the plea agreement says, if her testimony is required, she is required to provide her testimony.
But she's likely to testify against her husband if there's findings that there are things criminally wrong?
Well, depending on the outcome of the investigation, if anybody is charged and Alyssa Dann's testimony or Lenhoff's testimony is required, she's required to testify.
And what do you know about what her level of understanding, if you don't know what her understanding was, what it should have been, given what people were telling her about the propriety of her trying to get this grant?
I don't know what she indicated to you about the propriety of what people told her about the grant. She's been cooperative in interviews. She's admitted her participation in trying to secure the grant.
But did she know it was wrong or have reason to know it was wrong?
I believe the report will speak for itself, and that's the reason why we have a guilty plea in here. She admitted guilt and accountability for her misconduct, and this is a plea bargain from other more serious potential charges. So
but she just told us just a second ago that she, at the time, she didn't know it was wrong.
We have experienced in our investigative authority over the years that people say at the time they didn't know it was wrong and end up in a criminal courtroom and admit to the public that it was wrong by guilty plea, and that's what happened here today. And it's a sad day. It's a very, very difficult day for the spouse of the former Attorney General, herself a public official in her own right as the director of the journalism program, a small program at Youngstown State University, to admit a conflict of interest and a violation of the public responsibility she held.
Is there a statute of limitations